be talking about the conditions in the Middle East, and I'm thrilled to have some folks with some real knowledge joining us, some highly respected voices on Iran's geopolitical landscape, and they have extensive experience, both of our guests, in Middle East affairs. They are Iranian natives, board members of the Organization of Iranian American Communities, widely recognized by the U.S. Congress for their continued grassroots efforts to support foreign policy change to foster a brighter future for Iran. Majid Sadeghpour and Ramesh Sepehrrad, welcome.
Thank you, Dominic. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you for having me.
I mean, I feel like we as talk radios, black and otherwise, do not spend enough time talking about foreign policy. And one of the reasons I think that happens is because folks aren't armed with the knowledge that they need, the understanding that they need. So I'm really, really glad that you are here. And we've been hearing more and more about Iran in the kind of web of relationships and alliances and enmities that exist around what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the West Bank. So I almost don't know where to start, but so let's start with the easiest thing, what seems the easiest thing, which is today the Biden administration saying no way they will return to the negotiating table with Iran to talk about limiting some kind of a deal around nuclear arms, which we know happened under the Obama administration and then was trashed by the Trump administration, and the Iranian supreme leader saying yesterday that there might be an opening for a renewed conversation.
Right. Ramesh, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I can go first. I think, honestly, what we're seeing coming from the Iran supreme leader is yet another round of deception, a deceptive policy that they have employed, even dating all the way back to the pre-JCPOA, which was the nuclear deal that was struck during the Obama administration. So I'm very, very happy to see the Biden administration has come back and say, we're not going to talk to you until you demonstrate seriousness or a new approach. And by that, I want to really itemize what do we mean by that. Let the inspectors back in to Iran so that they can inspect what's happening on the nuclear sites. Stop the enrichment, the dangerous level of enrichment that the Iranian regime has reached. And in fact, our members of Congress announced last week that they could actually declare themselves as a nuclear power by end of this year. As well as turn the cameras on. So I think that the threat is getting to a point where it's serious, and the American administration, I know we're in an election year, must take this threat very, very seriously. And there are solutions. There are solutions on the table that we have to put in place. And that solution really is coming from the streets of Iran, where the Iranian people are protesting and rejecting this regime in its entirety. They're not being fooled by the message of so-called reformers or the moderates. This entire regime stands on a policy of terror, policy of proxy war, policy of nuclear bomb, and we should really see them for who they are and confront them accordingly. So I'm very happy to see the administration is coming back, and it's essentially pushing away this deceptive policy by Iran's supreme leader, who really runs the show. It's not the Iran's president. And then the other thing I also want to add, and I would love my colleague Majid to step in as well, is that Iran's new foreign minister is on the record, and he is saying that we're not in a business on solving any tension with America. We just want to manage the tension. The remarks by Iran's supreme leader yesterday by pretending that we are open to talks and negotiation on nuclear issue is part of their quote-unquote managing the tension. But we know what their intention is. Their intention is to get their hands on the bomb, and we should stop them. And their intention is to continue the same policy as the Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, who is a designated foreign terrorist organization. And you see Iran's new president, you see Iran's new foreign minister, who pride themselves by being part of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards Corps. You see that Iran's new foreign minister is saying that we're going to stand with Russia and China because they stood with us during the tough times. You see that he's saying that the priority is to continue the proxy war in the region because that's how they are going to stay in power. So when they talk about the priorities of Iran's foreign minister and what he's on record saying is that they're going to continue their misuse of media and lobbying power in America, they're going to continue the proxy war, and they're going to continue their regime's way of diplomacy, which is through terror and violence abroad as well as at home. So I would say I really do welcome the message from the administration, and I really would love my colleague Majid to also step in and add his perspective.
Yeah, Dr. Sadeghpour, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I would echo those remarks, and I would say the administration also recognized when this new president was installed, Pezeshkian, that he was not actually elected by the Iranian people. In fact, less than 90% of the Iranian people participate, less than 10% of the Iranian population participated in that supposed election. With that said, I think it would be helpful to kind of define what our problem with the regime in Iran is, and then hopefully we can get into what the United States can do in addition to what it has been doing thus far or in place of what it has been doing thus far. We know Iran is a prolific violator of human rights. It has killed in excess of 120,000 people since it came to power. During the past month, just this past month, as we are occupied with predicting whether Iran is going to retaliate after the assassination of an individual in Tehran, over 100 people have been killed in Iran since July 31st of 2024. Over the first 2 days of Pezeshkian's leadership, 29 people were executed. Dating back to 2023, Amnesty International has reported that Iran executed 74% of all global executions. That's an astronomical number. Iran only carries 1% of the global population. And so that's one problem, and that is established. So if you're negotiating with anything, anybody, I think one is you have to put that in the middle of the conversation, the people. And the executions are an indicator of the people's struggle against that regime. Otherwise, they wouldn't be executions. So the second problem with this regime, as you're seeing it across the Middle East playing out as it is the topic of our conversation, is terrorism. Well, Iran established a very prolific terrorism network across the globe, in large part to do what it is actually doing now, which is to kind of handcuff Western policymaking to make bloodshed outside of Iran so it can distract from the very executions and instability that it feels within the borders of Iran. And until when we address the first one, until we address the core issue, we will never address the terrorism that Iran supports, because it unfortunately increases alongside the executions in Iran. So we shouldn't be surprised to see prolific violations of, not violations, but rather exportation of terrorism across the Middle East and violence that Iran is at the center of. Regardless of who's actually doing the killing, Iran is at the center of that conversation, that problem. It's because inside the country, Iran is also executing, and they're related. And the third issue, of course, is the nuclear issue, which is another method the regime has used to blackmail and handcuff decisions of the Western world in addressing the wants and desires of the 90 million population and their own security. But let's look at the solution on the other hand. What has the United States done, or the Western world has done? We have tried pressuring the regime in Iran, regardless of, by the way, who is in the White House, whether it be President Biden or President Trump or Obama or Carter or Reagan. All of them have sought to either pressure the regime or negotiate the regime. But the goal of all of these administrations over more than 40 years and to this date is to change the regime's behavior. And what these executions tell us throughout that 40-year plus is that this regime is incapable of change. If it were, and we are going around and around of it, you referred to it relative to their potential opening for negotiations again. Now, we fall for that trap, and we continue to engage them as if they're capable of changing. So I want to kind of reiterate those points as we look at to what we do next, because what we do next is important.
All right, we continue this conversation. It sounds like what you're saying to me is what many celebrated, the election of a president who appears to be more of a reform-minded president is meaningless. I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting from what both of you just said. I'll look a little bit more at that. I want to talk about the hacking that we heard about on the Trump campaign. How widespread is that? And as you said, what are solutions? Because, you know, the United States is famous for regime change and meddling in ways that go beyond the scope of what we really ought to be doing in other nations. A low election turnout, is that a justification for, you know, the delegitimization of an election? That would delegitimize a lot of our elections here in the U.S., where people just don't bother to vote many times when it's not a presidential election. Lots of questions. We've got the scholars here who have some credible answers for you. That's straight ahead on KBLA Talk 1580. Dr. Majid Sadeghpour and Dr. Ramesh Sepehrrad are my guests, and they certainly are highly respected voices on Iran's geopolitical landscape. Dr. Sadeghpour, an Iranian American human rights advocate and the political director of the Organization of Iranian American Communities. Dr. Sepahrrad, an Iranian American author and scholar, practitioner with advanced degrees from the Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, and she's a technology executive and professor of practice in cybersecurity at the University of Connecticut, just to name a few of their qualifications. So many questions that we left on the table. You were talking about the continued unreliability or untrustworthiness of any kind of dealing with the Iranian state. You said regardless of who's in the White House, whether they're negotiating or threatening, we have these ongoing sanctions. We have, Obama actually had a deal in place. I always prefer diplomacy to war if I have the choice. We know that it sounds like what you're saying is the death by helicopter, by surprise helicopter crash of a more hardline president, and the election of someone who's perceived as more of a reformer in Masoud Pezeshkian is not consequential. Is that what I'm hearing?
That is very much the case, Dominic, and I'll expand on that. The regime in Iran is a misogynist regime that's built on the principle of Vilayat al-Faqih, or the supreme leader. And as Ramesh mentioned, that supreme leader makes all decisions in this world. In fact, Pezeshkian already admitted that all of his cabinet members were selected by the supreme leader. So that really defies the logic that he has any decisions to make relative to it. But I think I want to go back to something you ended the last segment with, which is elections, or whether people participate in elections or not. I think we got to look at it through a different litmus test. The elections in Iran are essentially occurring in a coercive environment. Your participation in elections almost is necessary for you to participate in society. Your national ID or your electronic digital tracking needs to show that you participated, yay or nay, so that you can get a promotion, get a job, get a contract, and continue living in society as quote-unquote an individual that is a part of the system. If you do not participate in election, entry in schools, in higher education, and advancement in jobs, it's almost impossible. So when you look at that sort of a coercive system of elections, you see that 90% non-participation has a significant cost for the population.
Yeah, it means something
But they're
different than
willing to endure
90%
it.
non-participation here, for sure.
That
Yeah,
is correct.
yeah, that's
That is
interesting.
correct. So, right, and that is really important. And I think I'll let Dr. Sepehrrad kind of expand on the other sections of your question.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, Iran is a theocracy. So it sounds like, because if the supreme leader is making all the decisions, picking cabinet members,
Yes,
why even have an election then?
that is
Exactly,
correct.
and I
But
think
the
you said
reason,
it. Yeah.
yeah, the
I'm sorry, go
reason they
ahead.
had done that is because they did that in large part to do what they're doing with this round, which is to fool the West or the international community, or even for a long time, even the Iranian people, that there is actually a democracy. Because keep in mind, Iran had just overthrown a single-party dictatorship run by an unelected monarch. So any Iranian people would have never voted for anything that didn't have a section or supposedly a portion of democracy within it. So they were clever in inserting. They just literally kept the same single-party system, but they removed the Shah and put the cleric right in place of it. And that is really where we are at, except that this is also supercharged with supposed authority from God. But ultimately, it is the same scenario, a single-party system where one individual makes all the decisions.
Dr. Ramesh Sepehrrad, you were talking before we went into news, traffic, and sports about how unreliable or untrustworthy the Iranian government or state is, regardless of what who's in the White House here, regardless of whether it's negotiation or leverage. So if you're saying the regime can't change, it sounds like then we're talking about regime change, which I really don't think is the U.S.'s job.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is not U.S.'s job. It is the job of the Iranian people. And
Right.
this is what our organization is advocating for. This is why we work very, very closely in a bipartisan way with our members of Congress so that the United States, along with its allies, can recognize the rights of the Iranian people to overthrow this regime, the rights of the Iranian people to self-defense against the brutal crackdown by the IRGC, the terrorist organization of IRGC, and the paramilitary groups that they unleash, and they kill teenagers, they kill women and girls in the streets. One thing I do want to add, Dominic, to what Majid just mentioned, the misogyny at core of this regime is how this regime operates. They consider women as the number one enemy. That's why this regime holds the highest number of female execution in the world. But then on the other side, when we talk about the alternative, when we talk about the path forward, when we talk about the solution and not locking our policy between either a war or talks with this regime, we look at the alternative that is being led by a woman who is a Muslim woman, who's disarming this theocracy from using religion as a weapon against people and actually standing on the non-nuclear secular republic platform so that we could have a multi-party system, so that we could have free and fair election, so that we could have a modern judicial system and gender equality and recognition of all Iranian nationalities as equal and the religions as equal. This is the alternative to this regime. And it's Maryam Rajavi who's leading that movement and who's also has been supported through the bipartisan House resolution multiple times in terms of the platform that she's presented on Iran. That is the path forward for U.S. policy, where we don't have to have a policy of regime change by U.S. war, but a policy of regime change by the people of Iran who are seeking a non-nuclear secular republic. I think that should be a cornerstone of U.S. policy, which has support of not just U.S. Majority of U.S. Congress, but European parliamentarian members as well as our Canadian parliamentarian members all across the world. This is the path forward when it comes to the Iran's challenge and Iran's policy dilemma that we're in right now.
Dr. Sepehrrad, we only have about a minute before news, traffic, and sports. And it sounds like you're saying that the U.S., it sounds like you're saying that the theocratic aspects of the regime are really trying to stall by reopening negotiations until they can actually stand up their nuclear weapons program.
They're buying time. You got it. They are buying time, and we need to really be very clear that United States stands with the people of Iran who are rejecting this regime in its entirety, and the people of Iran want regime change. So I think you're absolutely right. That's why when you look at the protests, they talk about down with the dictators. They talk about ending the proxy war when they say, no Gaza, no Libya, I give my life for Iran. These are the messages that are coming from the people of Iran that we need to really support and promote as a pillar of our policy on the situation in Iran right now.
Well, when we come forward after news, traffic, and sports, we'll unpack these cyber attacks, sort of get a little more clarity around the proxy wars, and more, taking a robust look at Iran's role in what's happening in the Middle East on KBLA Talk 1580. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of proxy wars and how Iran fits in to the terrible slaughter that's going on in Gaza, in the West Bank, and the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. When I say conflict, I'm talking about a political one, because obviously, Israel has the 15th most powerful military in the world, and so I don't know if a war is really an accurate description of what's happening there.
Right. If you don't mind, I'll try to address that question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I know. Sorry.
Yes, indeed. Well, let me just take a quick moment and take a trip back to memory lane. Back in the 1980s, when Iraq invaded Iran and the Ayatollahs were fighting the Iraqis, there was the Iran-Iraq war. Within 2 years, Iraq withdrew to international borders, and the United States brokered U.S. Security Council endorsed peace plan to end the war, but the regime in Iran, the Ayatollahs, the supreme leader at the time, Khomeini, rejected that plan and continued the war for another 6 years. And I remember every Monday would be our first day of school year. I'll go to class at the time, 14 or 15 years old. One of my classmates would be missing, and those classmates were recruited to go fight an unnecessary war. And nearly 1 million people, a lot of them young and teenage, were killed during that war after the peace plan that was proposed. And the reason the regime needed that war is because it was simultaneously massacring the Iranian people, exterminating a whole generation of opponents to Islamic rule in Iran. And that same scenario is playing out today. Except that war is now occurring in Gaza. What is going on is the regime in Iran is using its proxies to incite, and it is impervious, it is irrelevant to it how many people end up dying in retaliation, just like it didn't care that teenage Iranian kids were being killed in the useless war with Iraq after 1982. So what we are talking about in Iran, continuous support for carnage in the Middle East, is because it is weak. It is vulnerable. It needs to kill Iranians at an extraordinary rate. I referred to statistics a few minutes ago. And in order to do that, it needs to keep the international community silent. So, and in order to do that, it continues to feed these sorts of conflicts. That scenario has to change. And the way we can change that is, first and foremost, as Ramesh mentioned, recognize that the Iranian people don't want to change the regime's behavior. No longer. They want to change this regime. We came to this conclusion regarding South Africa with the apartheid regime. At some point, the Western world, led by the United States, made the decision that we recognize the South African people's desire to change that regime. And we didn't need to spend any money, as we do not need to spend money in Iran. We do not need to mobilize an army. We do not need to go to war. Iranian people have an organized resistance, have a qualified leader in Mariam Rajavi that Ramesh mentioned. What they are missing is that the international community now needs to first make the decision, take actions to isolate this regime as we did with the South African regime, hold these leaders accountable, and then politically support, pick up that phone call and reach out to the Iranian opposition, recognize them politically, and insert political life into the desire of the Iranian people so that they can get out there and make that change however they see fit. That is what's missing. It doesn't require a war. Neither does it require perpetual negotiations that have led us here.
What you're talking about is really more than changing a party or a leader. You're talking about changing a system, though, right?
Without a doubt. The entirety of the Iranian regime in its entirety. The Sharia law, the misogyny, the Islamic Republic as it stands, the single party rule that the Ayatollahs have, must go. And that is what the Iranian people are chanting. The Washington Post and New York Times actually quoted it during the uprisings of 2022, and that spilled into 2023. Down with dictator, be it the Shah or leader. What the people are taking bullets for, what those young girls are dying for today and were then, is rejecting single-party rule. If we acknowledge that, as we did with South Africa, we would have gone a long way in addressing one of the greatest threats to human civilization, Islamic fundamentalism. At the core of it sits the predatory Ayatollahs in Tehran.
When you talk about, South Africa as a comparison, we're talking about something that was maybe easier to understand because it was a racial hierarchy, right? As a system of governments under apartheid. What you're talking about, what you're describing in Iran, is a theocracy, sort of disguised as a democracy. And so I think it's a little bit more difficult for people to understand what you're changing from to.
I think I can address that. I think.
Well, go ahead, Dr. Ramesh.
What we want to change to is a non-nuclear, secular Republic Iran that is in coexistence, that can live peacefully with its neighbors and end the proxy wars. This is what we want to change to. And I think if you look at the protests inside Iran, if you look at the slogans coming from the protests, who are, by the way, many women and girls are participating and even leading these protests, that message is, let's end the gender apartheid in Iran. Let's really celebrate a vision of gender equality. So I think, to Majid's point, there are lots of similarities between what we're dealing with Iran versus South African case that he brought up. And I think what's really in common is the approach that we need to take from the United States and the world leaders and the U.S. and its allies in really supporting the voice of change that's authentic and that is homegrown, as opposed to a change that is through a puppet or the manufacturing of opposition efforts that has been seen in the history.
We will continue our conversation with Dr. Ramesh Sepehrrad and Dr. Majid Sadeghpour when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580. We talk about what the people want versus what the government wants, and how we, as West members of the Western superpower, the United States of America, how we can step up and help or not. And so, I mean, what should we be doing, in that sense, to influence our political leaders, or to have a better awareness ourselves? I mean, Dr. Sadeghpour, you actually fled Iran, right? And And so
Yes.
I'm sure it must be very personal for you, and I'm sure you don't forget at all what conditions are like on the ground there for folks. So what ought we be doing as allies?
I think the United States already has in its arsenal everything that it needs. And I think the Iranian people have everything for that change that we're talking about already within Iran. So there will be no need for America to spend capital or lives. The Iranian people, all these executions that I alluded to earlier, all these killings and continued resistance is an indicator that the people are willing to sacrifice. But in order to make a change occur, the Iranian people also have an organized resistance that is required for change. You need to have an organization. And Maryam Rajavi is president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. That is the political body. And of course, the leadership is there. And then there is the plan in order to make that change occur anywhere, whether it be the United States or in Iran. You need a plan. And Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan for future Iran, Ramesh alluded to some of the highlights of it, what sort of Iran they envision. But in order to make this change occur in Iran, what the United States can do to kind of get guidance from really the United States Congress. You know, just a few weeks ago, we had a memorial in the United States Congress. We spoke, both of us spoke, remembering and honoring the life and memory of Representative Sheila Jackson Lee that passed away a few weeks ago. During that event, members of congressional delegation from California spoke as well. And the event was about House Resolution 1148, where over 225 members of Congress have announced bipartisan majority support for the democratic, secular, and non-nuclear republic in Iran, kind of guided by the arguments we've made here today, by the 10-point plan for a future of Iran. The people of Iran have an organized resistance. What's missing, what America can do, is to first make a decision that this regime, that the change of this regime is a necessity as it is being articulated by the people of Iran. And then lend the people of Iran that political support and reach out to organized opposition of the Iranian people, see what they've got to say. And I think if we were to do that and pressure the regime and hold the regime accountable on the diplomatic front, on the economic front, then I think the change in Iran is not only inevitable, is really not only possible, it's really inevitable in the near term.
Dr. Sepehrrad, you teach Middle East studies, and you also are a technology executive. Can you give me a kind of an overview of what we're talking about when we look at this when we talk about this Iranian cyber attacks, how widespread it might be, and what we think the reasons for that are?
Yeah, and I think it's to previous conversations and discussions we've had so far, is the cyber attack is part and parcel of Iran's foreign policy and plan to not only steal information, but also really sow discord and promote misinformation and demonization campaign in cyber. I think what we've seen over the last few weeks on how they're targeting election campaigns, whether it's on the Republican side of the House or the Democrat side of the House, their approach has been to start with a phishing, what we call a phishing attack, which their hacking group comes in and sends a normal message to either current or formal officials, and they are essentially stealing information through that correspondence. And once they have the information, they're able to use that information in order to launch a campaign through bots or through various viruses or malware to continue to really push a narrative that supports the agenda of Iran's IRGC, the terrorist organization of IRGC. So we really have to kind of see Iran's cyber threat in a broader context of the threat of the Iranian regime and understand how do we confront this? How do we address we have this phrase in our own discussion that how do we address the head of snake in Tehran, which is essentially the snake that has its reach within the region through proxy war, has its reach through global cyber attacks and misinformation and demonization campaign. To be honest, Dominic, Majid, and I have been targets of the demonization campaign and the cyber attacks as well. We're not immune to it either. So they're constantly trying to come through various means of countering our points and our argument for democracy and freedom in Iran. So I think we just need to kind of look at it holistically and address this threat by Tehran's regime in a more holistic way.
You're also the chair of the advisory board of the Organization of Iranian American Communities, 40 chapters across the country. Dr. Sepehrrad, what ought we be reading? Like sometimes it's knowing the right publications or websites to be checking so we can get a better perspective to filter the news that's coming in.
You know, Dominic, I'm so glad you're asking that question, and thank you for really seeking our advice on what to read. And I say this not to promote our organization, but I think our Organization of Iranian American Community, is the only Iranian American community that is a grassroots. We are not lobbyists. We have members across 40 states. Among our members, there are former political prisoners. There are mothers who have lost their loved ones. There are children who have lost their parents to this regime. There are witnesses. They have key, important testimonies to provide and help raise awareness. So I would say, please reach out to us. Please reach out to and understand and subscribe to our newsletter, because we not only monitor what's happening on the ground in Iran, but we also tie it into what it means to America. And that is the role that we play, and we continue to play in order to raise the awareness and really get the accurate and I guess the facts, not the fiction that's out there, because the Iranian regime has been notorious in creating and manufacturing narratives, whether the narrative is coming from the former monarchs who were overthrown through the 1979 revolution, or the IRGC lobbyists in Washington. We really need to understand what is the message that's coming from inside Iran, and what does that mean to America. And this is what OIAC supports to make that translation. Our website is www.oiac.org. Please visit us. Please reach out to us. Please subscribe to our newsletter. And we would love to really continue to come back to your program and raise awareness also through dialogue and discussion.
Absolutely. That would be amazing. OIAC.org. Got about a minute left. And probably should have asked you this hours ago, but we were really dealing with some basics. We've heard that, Hezbollah and Israel going back and forth, bombing on each other, has sort of neutralized each other in a way, and that Iran may be standing down somewhat rather than escalating into a larger war in the region right now. What do you say to that, Dr. Sadeghpour?
Excellent question. The reason you see that kind of hindrance on both sides, I can speak certainly to the fact that the regime in Iran, we talked about it here today also, it is very vulnerable. It is trying to keep enough pressure on the West by causing enough bloodshed, enough conflict to keep the world occupied, but not enough to engulf itself. It both needs the conflict, it's also afraid of the conflict consequences. So that's why you see this yo-yo behavior in the regime. And all the while, though, one thing is consistent: the killings inside Iran. And as I refer to the 100 or so executions over the past 30 days, since that assassination in Iran, and that same day that that president got inaugurated in Iran, nearly 100 people have been killed. So this yo-yoing effect is by design. Iran is incapable of engaging the international community, the West in general, wholeheartedly to Hezbollah or whoever, but also incapable of extinguishing that fire.
Gonna have to leave it there.
Allowing that extinguishing the fire.
Dr. Sepehrrad and Dr. Sadeghpour, thank you so much. Look forward to talking with you again soon.